England, 1860. Crystal chandeliers cast golden radiance across Lord Ashworth's grand ballroom, illuminating a sea of silk gowns and perfectly tailored evening coats adorning London's finest society. In a shadowed alcove, partially concealed behind an ornate marble pillar, stood Miss Arabella Peaton. Her 39 years seemed to weigh upon her shoulders like an invisible mantle as she observed the swirling dancers. "One must wonder," whispered Lady Margaret Thornby to her companion, her voice barely audible above the orchestral waltz, yet carrying with perfect clarity to Arabella's ears. "Why Miss Peaton continues to grace these gatherings. Surely after nearly 2 decades she might retire with some dignity intact." The word struck Arabella with familiar precision, each syllable a reminder of her unchanging status in society's carefully ordered hierarchy. She straightened her spine with practiced grace, smoothed the midnight blue silk of her gown, a shade deemed appropriate for a woman of her years and circumstances, and maintained her composure with the skill of one who had endured countless such observations. At 39, Arabella had long since grown accustomed to serving as fodder for drawing-room gossip, the spinster daughter of the respected Peaton family. She had witnessed her younger sisters marry well, watched as her contemporaries established households and bore children, seen the society that once welcomed her as a hopeful debutante gradually transform her into an object of pity and whispered speculation. "Miss Peaton," came a familiar voice at her elbow. Her brother William, Earl of Ravenshollow, appeared beside her with the concerned expression she had grown to recognize over the years. "You appear rather pale this evening. Shall I escort you to the refreshment room?" "Thank you, William, but I am quite well," she replied, offering the practiced smile that had served her through countless social encounters. "I was merely observing the season's new debutantes. Lady Ashworth has assembled a particularly lovely collection this year." William's expression softened with the mixture of affection and worry that characterized all his interactions with his unmarried sister. "Arabella, you need not feel obligated to attend every social function. No one would think less of you if you chose to retreat entirely from society," she interrupted with uncharacteristic directness. "To become the reclusive aunt who appears only at christenings and funerals. No, William, I may not have secured a husband, but I refuse to simply vanish into obscurity." Before her brother could formulate a response, a sudden hush fell across the ballroom. Even the orchestra seemed to falter momentarily in its melodic progression. All eyes turned toward the grand entrance, where the butler stood at attention. "His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield," the servant announced with impressive formality. "Alexander Montclair, 7th Duke of Thornfield." The man who appeared in the doorway commanded immediate attention through sheer presence alone. Tall and imposing in his perfectly fitted evening attire, his dark hair swept back from features that seemed carved from the finest marble. At 37, Alexander Montclair remained London's most sought-after bachelor, his title ancient and prestigious, his fortune vast beyond imagination, his estates among the most prosperous in all of England. "He appears particularly formidable this evening," William murmured to his sister. "I wonder which unfortunate young lady will be thrust into his path tonight." Arabella watched as the assembled company parted before the Duke like water before the prow of a great ship. Despite his legendary wealth and exalted position, Alexander Montclair was renowned for his aloofness, his exacting standards, and his apparent imperviousness to even the most determined matrimonial campaigns waged by ambitious mothers throughout the ton. 3 matches he has declined this season alone. William continued his commentary. Lady Ashworth must be beside herself with anxiety. Her own daughter numbers among this year's hopefuls. "Perhaps," Arabella found herself saying with surprising candor, "he finds the endless parade of innocence somewhat tedious." Her brother raised an eyebrow at this observation. "Speaking from personal experience, sister." "Speaking as one who has observed 20 seasons from the sidelines," she corrected gently. "There is a certain predictability to it all, is there not?" As the evening progressed, Arabella maintained her customary position of dignified observation. She exchanged pleasantries with long-standing acquaintances, partnered with her brother-in-law for a single country dance, and otherwise remained largely unobtrusive, a skill she had perfected through years of necessity. It was during the supper interval that chance intervened in the most unexpected manner. Making her way toward the ladies' withdrawing room for a brief respite from the crowded ballroom, Arabella rounded a corner and collided directly with a solid masculine form approaching from the opposite direction. "I beg your pardon," she began, flustered by the unexpected encounter, then felt her breath catch as she found herself gazing directly into the penetrating blue eyes of the Duke of Thornfield himself. "The fault is entirely mine, madam," he replied, his voice deep and resonant. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond its natural boundaries, his gaze lingered upon her face, with an intensity that caused her pulse to quicken unexpectedly. "Miss Peaton," she supplied, offering a curtsy appropriate to his exalted rank. "Miss Peaton," he repeated, as though committing the name to memory with deliberate care. Then, with a formal bow that spoke of perfect breeding, he continued on his way. Such a brief encounter would normally be forgotten before the evening's conclusion. Yet as Arabella rejoined the gathering, she could not dispel the peculiar sensation that the Duke's penetrating gaze continued to follow her movements across the crowded ballroom. Later, as the orchestra struck up a waltz, Arabella prepared to retreat further into the shadows that had become her natural habitat. It was then that a familiar, deep voice spoke at her shoulder with startling proximity. "Miss Peaton, might I request the honor of this dance?" The ballroom seemed to suspend its collective breath as the Duke of Thornfield extended his gloved hand toward the most unlikely recipient imaginable. Arabella felt the weight of 100 astonished gazes settling upon her with almost physical pressure. "Your Grace," she began, her voice barely audible above the musical accompaniment, "I fear you may have mistaken me for someone else." "I am not in the habit of making such errors, Miss Peaton," he replied, the faintest suggestion of amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. "The waltz awaits. Will you honor me with your acceptance?" 20 years of social conditioning urged her to decline, to spare them both the inevitable speculation and whispered commentary. Yet something in his unwavering gaze compelled her to place her gloved hand in his outstretched palm. "The honor is mine, Your Grace," she managed to reply as he escorted her onto the polished floor. The whispers erupted throughout the assembly like a disturbed hive of bees. The Duke of Thornfield, who had declined to dance with the season's most celebrated beauties, was leading Miss Arabella Peaton, 39 years old and thoroughly unmarried, into a waltz. "You realize, of course, that you have just scandalized the entire gathering," Arabella murmured, as they assumed the proper position for the dance. "Have I?" he replied with apparent unconcern, his hands settling with practiced ease at her waist. "I was under the impression that I was merely dancing with the most intriguing woman present." The music began, and Arabella found herself swept into the waltz with a grace she had not experienced in many years. The Duke led with confident precision, his steps perfectly matched to hers, creating the remarkable illusion that they had danced together countless times before. "You waltz beautifully, Miss Peaton," he observed, as they moved through the intricate patterns of the dance. "Practice, Your Grace," she replied with honest simplicity, "though I confess it has been considerable time since I was last invited to participate." "Then the gentlemen of London have demonstrated remarkably poor judgment," he stated with conviction. Arabella could not suppress a soft laugh at this unexpected gallantry, a genuine sound that drew even more curious stares from the surrounding observers. "You are either extraordinarily kind or deliberately provocative, Your Grace. I have yet to determine which." "Perhaps both," he conceded, guiding her through a graceful turn with effortless skill. "Tell me, Miss Peaton, do you find these social gatherings enjoyable?" "They serve their purpose," she answered diplomatically. "That was not what I asked," he pressed gently. The directness of his inquiry unsettled her. It had been years since anyone had sought her genuine opinion with such apparent interest, as though her thoughts possessed actual worth. "No," she admitted finally. "I find them rather tedious, but one must maintain proper appearances." "Indeed," he murmured, and for a brief moment she glimpsed something in his expression, a fleeting shadow that suggested he too wore a carefully constructed mask for society's benefit. As the final notes of the waltz faded into silence, the Duke escorted her back to the edge of the ballroom with perfect courtesy. Before taking his departure, he bent slightly to speak near her ear with intimate discretion. Thank you for the dance, Miss Petton. It was unquestionably the most pleasant aspect of an otherwise insufferable evening. Then he was gone, moving through the crowd with that distinctive combination of authority and detachment that seemed uniquely his, leaving Arabella to face the approaching tide of curious acquaintances, all desperate to discover what the Duke of Thornfield could possibly have said to the spinster of Peaton House. Chapter 2. Roses and Revelations. The morning following the Ashworth ball dawned grey and drizzling, a fitting accompaniment to Arabella's contemplative mood as she sat at her writing desk, composing correspondence to her married sister in Hampshire. She had nearly convinced herself that the previous evening's encounter with the Duke represented nothing more than an amusing aberration until her butler appeared at the morning-room door. "A delivery for you, Miss Peaton," he announced, his normally impassive voice betraying the faintest hint of surprise. Behind him, a footman struggled with an enormous arrangement of deep crimson roses, so abundant they nearly obscured his face entirely. As the crystal vase was placed upon a side table, Arabella stared in complete bewilderment. "There must be some error," she protested weakly. "No mistake, miss," the butler replied, extending a small cream-colored card upon a silver salver. The messenger was most particular in his instructions. With fingers that trembled slightly despite her efforts at composure, Arabella accepted the card. Upon it, written in a bold masculine hand, were the words, "To brighten a dreary London morning, Thornfield." "Merciful heavens," she whispered, the card nearly slipping from her grasp. "Will there be a reply, Miss Peaton?" "Not at present," she managed, still staring at the magnificent blooms as though they might vanish if she looked away. When the servants had withdrawn, Arabella approached the flowers with cautious steps, inhaling their rich fragrance. In all her 39 years, no gentleman had ever sent her flowers, not even during her debut season, when she had been young and passably attractive, if never a true beauty. "What purpose does this serve?" she murmured to herself, gently touching one velvety petal. Her private contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of her sister-in-law Catherine, Countess of Ravenshollow, who burst into the room in a rustle of morning silk and barely contained excitement. "Is it true?" Catherine demanded without preamble. "Did the Duke of Thornfield truly send you roses?" Arabella sighed at the inevitable intrusion. News travels with remarkable velocity in this household. "The servants are all talking," Catherine replied, circling the arrangement with wide eyes. "Arabella, these must have cost a small fortune at this time of year." "I am certain it represents merely a courtesy following our dance," Arabella said, attempting to sound dismissive despite her inner confusion. Catherine fixed her with a shrewd look that spoke of years observing society's intricate machinations. "The Duke of Thornfield does not dance with spinsters, nor does he send them roses as mere courtesy. Something most unusual is occurring here." Before Arabella could formulate an adequate response, the butler reappeared. "Lord Ravenshollow requests Miss Peaton's presence in his study immediately." Downstairs, William paced before the fireplace with obvious agitation, stopping only when Arabella entered the room. "I have just returned from my club," he began without preamble, "where the entire membership speaks of nothing save you and Thornfield." Arabella settled into a chair with resignation. "Surely there are more pressing matters worthy of discussion." "Not during the London season," William replied grimly, "particularly when the most sought-after bachelor in England has publicly singled out—" He stopped abruptly. "A spinster of advanced years," Arabella completed for him calmly. "You need not soften your words, William. I am well aware of my position in society's hierarchy." Her brother had the grace to appear contrite. "Forgive me. I meant only that the situation is unusual. Thornfield has rejected countless eligible young ladies of impeccable breeding. Why should he suddenly demonstrate interest in someone who is manifestly unsuitable?" she finished. "I assure you, I have asked myself the identical question repeatedly." William approached and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his with genuine concern. "Arabella, I fear for your welfare. If Thornfield is engaging in some form of cruel amusement at your expense, then I shall be no worse situated than I am presently," she interrupted softly. "And if his interest proves genuine, however unlikely that may seem, then I should be foolish indeed to reject it out of excessive caution." Her brother studied her face intently. "You find him attractive?" Arabella withdrew her hands gently. I found our conversation refreshingly honest. Nothing more significant than that. And now he has sent flowers, which is certainly flattering, though hardly indicative of serious matrimonial intent. Exercise caution, William warned, rising to his feet. Thornfield may be the most eligible man in England, but his reputation suggests a certain coldness of temperament. Some say he terminated his last courtship because Lady Vivian Hartwell laughed too enthusiastically at dinner. Arabella raised an eyebrow skeptically. Gossip, William. I expected better discernment from you. Not gossip, genuine concern, he corrected firmly. You have constructed a life of dignity despite society's frequent cruelties. I would not see you wounded by a man incapable of recognizing your true worth. Chapter 3. The Royal Academy. The conversation lingered in Arabella's thoughts as she prepared for the family's traditional afternoon visit to the Royal Academy exhibition. It was one of the few social occasions where her unmarried status attracted little notice, art appreciation being considered an entirely acceptable pursuit for ladies of all circumstances. She selected a walking dress of deep forest green, a color that complemented her auburn hair and pale complexion admirably. As her maid arranged her carefully styled locks, Arabella found herself paying unusual attention to her appearance, adding a touch of color to her cheeks and selecting her finest lace collar. Foolishness, she repeated to herself, though with considerably less conviction than before. At the Royal Academy, the Peaton party moved slowly through the crowded galleries, examining landscapes and portraits amid the press of fashionable London society. Arabella had just separated from her family to study a particularly fine seascape, when a familiar voice spoke beside her with startling proximity. Turner, at his most masterful. Would you not agree, Miss Peaton? She turned to discover the Duke of Thornfield, standing at her elbow, resplendent in perfectly tailored morning attire that emphasized his commanding height and broad shoulders. Your Grace, she acknowledged with a small curtsy. Yes, his comprehension of light remains unparalleled among contemporary artists. You possess genuine appreciation for artistic endeavors? He inquired, his blue eyes studying her face with that same unsettling intensity she recalled from their previous encounter. I do, she replied simply, though I claim no particular expertise, merely an enthusiast's pleasure in beautiful things. How refreshing, he said, offering his arm with courtly grace. Shall we continue to the next gallery? I find most commentary regarding art to be insufferably affected, but I suspect yours might prove the exception to that general rule. Aware of the curious glances directed toward them from all quarters, Arabella hesitated momentarily before placing her gloved hand lightly upon his offered arm. You risk further scandal, Your Grace. 2 public encounters in as many days will certainly intensify the speculation regarding your intentions. Let them speculate to their heart's content, he replied dismissively. I have endured society's gossip for years without suffering any lasting damage. It holds no terror for me whatsoever. As they progressed through the exhibition together, Arabella found herself gradually relaxing into genuine conversation. The Duke possessed authentic knowledge of artistic matters, acquired through extensive travel and serious study rather than mere fashionable interest. More surprising still was his apparent willingness to listen to her observations, responding with thoughtful commentary that built upon her ideas rather than dismissing them as feminine fancy. You have visited Florence personally, he asked as they paused before an Italian landscape of considerable beauty. Alas, no, she admitted. My knowledge derives entirely from books and exhibitions such as this. I have never travelled beyond England's borders. Something resembling surprise flickered across his aristocratic features. Never, with your evident appreciation for art and culture, I had assumed. My circumstances have not permitted extensive travel, she explained simply, without self-pity or elaborate justification. The Duke's expression shifted subtly, taking on a quality she could not quite identify. A considerable oversight on Fortune's part. The Uffizi Gallery alone would provide you with sufficient material for lifelong contemplation. Before she could respond to this unexpected observation, they were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Ashworth and her daughter, the lovely but vapid Miss Penelope Ashworth. whose unsuccessful attempts to secure the Duke's romantic attention at her mother's ball had been the subject of considerable whispered commentary throughout the ton. "Your Grace," Lady Ashworth exclaimed, her surprise at discovering him in Miss Peaton's company poorly concealed beneath a veneer of social grace. "What an unexpected pleasure. Penelope and I were just admiring the Reynolds portrait in the adjoining room." "Lady Ashworth, Miss Ashworth," the Duke acknowledged with a correctly polite but notably cool bow. "I trust you are finding the exhibition educational." "Oh, immensely," gushed Miss Ashworth, moving subtly closer to him while pretending Arabella did not exist. "Though I confess these historical subjects can be rather tedious, I much prefer more romantic themes in art." The Duke's expression remained impassive. "Indeed, Miss Peaton and I were just discussing Turner's revolutionary approach to light and atmospheric effects. She has offered several observations that I found quite illuminating." All eyes turned to Arabella, who felt warmth rising to her cheeks at this unexpected public praise from such a source. "How interesting," Lady Ashworth replied, her smile tightening perceptibly. "I had no idea Miss Peaton harbored such scholarly inclinations." "Few people trouble themselves to discover what lies beneath surface appearances," the Duke replied, his tone carrying a subtle edge that was lost on neither woman present. An uncomfortable silence followed, broken only when William appeared at Arabella's side, his expression mixing concern with curiosity. "Arabella, Mother requests your company," he said diplomatically, nodding formally to the assembled group. "Your Grace, Lady Ashworth, Miss Ashworth." With a graceful curtsy to the Duke and polite acknowledgement of the Ashworth ladies, Arabella allowed herself to be escorted away, though she could feel the Duke's penetrating gaze following her retreat. "That represents twice in 2 days," William murmured under his breath as they rejoined the family party. "And now the roses as well. People are beginning to take notice, Arabella." "People always notice, William," she replied wearily. "The difference lies in what they choose to discuss." "Not about you," he countered meaningfully. "Not in this particular manner." The remainder of the afternoon passed in a haze of strained conversation and speculative glances. By the time the Peaton party returned home, Arabella felt emotionally exhausted from the constant scrutiny and whispered speculation. Retreating to her private sitting room, she discovered another delivery awaiting her attention. A beautifully bound volume of Turner's collected works, accompanied by a note in the Duke's now familiar handwriting. "For a fellow admirer of genius. Perhaps you might permit me to call tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Thornfield." Arabella sank into her favorite chair, clutching the book to her chest as her mind whirled with confusion and a dangerous flutter of hope that she had thought permanently extinguished. Chapter 4. A Declaration. The following afternoon found Arabella seated in the Peaton House drawing room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to conceal their trembling as the mantel clock ticked inexorably toward 3 o'clock. She had spent the morning in uncharacteristic indecision, changing her gown multiple times before settling upon a dress of deep burgundy that complemented her coloring and brought warmth to her pale complexion. "This is madness," she whispered to herself as the clock chimed the appointed hour. "A man of the Duke's position has no serious interest in someone like me." Yet even as the words left her lips, the butler appeared at the drawing-room entrance. "His Grace the Duke of Thornfield," he announced, his tone suggesting that he too found the situation extraordinary. Alexander Montclair entered the room with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention wherever he appeared. Dressed impeccably in a charcoal morning coat and dove-grey waistcoat, he seemed to transform the familiar drawing-room simply through his presence. "Miss Peaton," he greeted her, bowing over her extended hand with perfect courtesy. "You are most gracious to receive me." "Your Grace," she replied, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from her own. "I confess your request came as something of a surprise." "A pleasant one, I hope?" he inquired, taking the offered seat. Arabella hesitated. "A puzzling one, I must admit. You cannot be unaware that your attentions have caused considerable speculation." A smile, brief but genuine, transformed his typically stern features. "Excellent. London society has grown far too comfortable with its rigid expectations, A little disruption seems long overdue. "Is that my purpose?" she asked quietly. "To serve as an agent of social disruption." The Duke studied her face with that penetrating gaze that seemed to perceive far more than surface appearances. "You serve many purposes, Miss Peaton, but mere social rebellion is certainly not among them." The butler's return with refreshments provided Arabella with a momentary respite from the intensity of his attention. As she poured tea for them both, she was acutely conscious of the domestic intimacy of the scene, something she had observed countless times between her married sisters and their husbands, yet had never experienced personally. "You enjoyed the book?" the Duke inquired, accepting his cup with gracious acknowledgement. "Very much indeed," she replied, relaxing slightly at this shift to safer conversational territory. "The color illustrations are magnificent. Thank you for such a thoughtful gift." "It seemed appropriate," he said. "Your observations yesterday revealed genuine appreciation that deserves cultivation and encouragement." Arabella sipped her tea carefully, gathering courage for the question that had haunted her since their encounter at the exhibition. "Your Grace, forgive my directness, but I must ask, why have you chosen to single me out for these attentions?" Alexander set down his cup, his expression becoming serious. "Because in a world filled with artifice and calculated performance, you represent authenticity. Because when you speak, you express genuine thoughts rather than words designed to flatter. Because your eyes reflect intelligence and depth of feeling that I find genuinely compelling." The simple honesty of his response left Arabella momentarily speechless. No man had ever addressed her with such straightforward admiration, not even during her youth, when she still harbored conventional hopes of marriage. "I am 39 years old, Your Grace," she reminded him, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil his words had created. "I possess neither fortune nor particular beauty, and my accomplishments extend no further than those expected of any properly educated gentlewoman. I am hardly worthy," he repeated, a distinct edge entering his voice. A curious choice of words. "Tell me, Miss Peaton, by what standards do you measure human worth? Youth, beauty, material wealth? These seem remarkably superficial criteria for a woman of your evident intelligence." Arabella flushed at this gentle rebuke. "You misunderstand me. I meant only that society has certain expectations." "Society," he interrupted, "has consistently demonstrated profound inability to recognize genuine value when presented with it. I, however, am not so limited in my perceptions." A charged silence settled between them, broken only when the Duke rose and moved to the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon light filtering through the glass. "Perhaps I should speak with complete clarity," he said, turning back to face her directly. "I have spent the past 15 years avoiding matrimony, Miss Peaton, because I had never encountered a woman whose company I could imagine tolerating for an entire lifetime until now." Arabella stared at him, certain she had misunderstood his meaning. "Your Grace, if this represents some form of jest—" "I do not engage in humor regarding matters of such significance," he replied gravely. "I am fully aware that my attention has placed you in an uncomfortable position. Society whispers, your family worries, and you yourself must question the sincerity of my regard." He returned to his seat, leaning forward with evident intent. "Allow me to clarify my intentions completely. I wish to court you, Miss Peaton, with absolute propriety and respect. If, after a period of better acquaintance, you find my company as agreeable as I find yours, I hope you might consider a more permanent arrangement." Arabella felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "You cannot possibly be serious." "I have never been more serious regarding any matter in my entire existence," he replied simply. "The potential scandal means nothing to me. The disparity in our social positions is relevant only if we choose to make it so. Your family's concerns are understandable, but not my primary consideration. I am master of my own household and answer to no one regarding my choice of bride." His methodical dismissal of each obvious objection left Arabella virtually speechless. Finally, she managed to voice the question that lay at the heart of her disbelief. "Why me, Your Grace? After all these years of refusing every eligible match in London, why would you choose someone society considers thoroughly unmarriageable?" Alexander's expression softened perceptibly. Because when we danced, Miss Peaton, I felt for the first time that I was in the presence of a woman who saw me. Not the Duke, not the fortune, not the ancient title, but the man beneath all those external trappings. Do you have any conception of how rare such recognition truly is? Before she could respond, the drawing-room door opened to admit Lady Peaton, Arabella's mother, whose shock at discovering the Duke of Thornfield in their drawing-room was poorly concealed beneath her customary social grace. "Your Grace," she exclaimed, offering a deep curtsy. "What an extraordinary honor. I do apologize for this intrusion." "Not at all, Lady Peaton," Alexander replied, rising to bow respectfully. "I was merely discussing the Royal Academy exhibition with your daughter. Her insights prove most illuminating indeed." Lady Peaton's gaze moved between them with obvious confusion, clearly struggling to comprehend the scene before her. "How delightful. Arabella has always maintained an interest in artistic matters, though I fear her observations may lack the sophistication to genuinely interest someone of your distinguished background, Your Grace." Arabella felt the familiar sting of her mother's casual dismissal, a subtle diminishment she had endured for years as her matrimonial prospects faded into distant memory. "On the contrary," the Duke replied, his voice cooling perceptibly, "Miss Peaton's understanding rivals that of many so-called experts among my acquaintance. You must feel considerable pride in her accomplishments." Lady Peaton blinked in evident surprise, clearly unaccustomed to hearing her eldest daughter praised by anyone, least of all by one of the most powerful men in England. "Yes, of course," she stammered. "Arabella has always been studious." The Duke turned his attention back to Arabella, pointedly ignoring the obvious discomfort his presence had created in her mother. "Miss Peaton, might I prevail upon you to accompany me to the conservatory at Kew Gardens tomorrow? The tropical specimens are particularly magnificent this season." Aware of her mother's widening eyes, Arabella hesitated only briefly before nodding her acceptance. "I should like that very much, Your Grace." "Excellent. Shall we say 11 o'clock? I shall send my carriage for you." With that declaration, he bowed to both ladies and took his departure, leaving behind a vacuum of stunned silence in his wake. "Arabella," Lady Peaton breathed when the front door had closed behind him, "what in heaven's name is transpiring here? First the roses, now a private call and an invitation to Kew Gardens. The Duke of Thornfield appears to be courting you." "So it would seem, Mother," Arabella replied, still struggling to absorb the reality of the situation herself. Lady Peaton sank into a chair, fanning herself vigorously. "But why? After all these years of being, that is to say, to suddenly attract the attention of the most eligible bachelor in all of England, it defies all comprehension." Arabella winced at her mother's artless honesty. "Thank you for that assessment, Mother." Lady Peaton had the grace to appear abashed. "Forgive me, my dear. I did not intend to imply, that is, you have always been accomplished and well-bred, naturally, but at your age—" "Yes, Mother, I am quite aware of my advanced years," Arabella interrupted with uncharacteristic sharpness, "as I believe is the Duke himself." "But what can he possibly want?" Lady Peaton persisted, bewilderment evident in every line of her features. Arabella rose, suddenly weary of the conversation and its implications. "Perhaps, Mother, he desires what any man seeks in a potential wife: companionship, understanding, and mutual respect." Chapter 5. Kew Gardens. The excursion to Kew Gardens proved transformative. As Alexander guided Arabella through the magnificent glass structures housing exotic plants from across the empire, she found herself relaxing completely into genuine conversation. They paused beneath the soaring glass dome of the Palm House, surrounded by towering tropical specimens. "It rather resembles stepping into another world entirely," Arabella remarked, tilting her head back to admire the architectural marvel above them. "Indeed," the Duke agreed, though his gaze remained fixed upon her upturned face rather than their exotic surroundings. "Miss Peaton, may I speak with complete frankness?" She lowered her gaze to meet his, her heart quickening at the intensity she discovered there. "Of course, Your Grace." "I sense that you harbor serious doubts regarding my intentions," he said directly, "that perhaps you suspect some ulterior motive behind my interest in your company." Arabella hesitated, torn between honesty and diplomatic discretion. "You must admit, Your Grace, that your attention comes as something of a surprise. I would be naive indeed not to question it. He nodded slowly, accepting her candor. Fair enough. Then permit me to address those doubts with equal directness. I am 37 years old, Miss Peaton. I have spent the past 15 years fending off increasingly desperate attempts by matchmaking mothers to secure my title for their daughters. I have been paraded before every eligible young lady from Land's End to John O'Groats, and I have found them universally tedious. Pretty faces concealing empty minds, or worse still, calculating ambitions disguised as innocence. He stepped closer, his voice lowering with conviction. And then, at yet another interminable social gathering, I encountered a woman who stood apart from the usual posturing and performance, a woman who observed the proceedings with clear-eyed intelligence and a hint of well-earned cynicism, a woman whose conversation, when I finally contrived an opportunity to experience it, revealed depth and substance rather than the usual vapid pleasantries. Arabella felt warmth rising in her cheeks under his steady regard. You make me sound far more interesting than reality would suggest, Your Grace. On the contrary, he replied firmly, I suspect I have only begun to discover how genuinely fascinating you are, Miss Peaton, and I find myself eager to continue that discovery if you will permit it. Their intimate conversation was interrupted by a group of fashionable ladies whose exclamations of surprise at encountering the Duke echoed through the humid air. Lady Fairfax, a notorious gossip, approached with poorly concealed disdain. Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. And Miss Peaton as well. How unusual. The Duke's expression cooled perceptibly. Lady Fairfax, Miss Peaton and I were just discussing the remarkable architectural achievements of Decimus Burton. You will forgive us if we continue our tour. Without awaiting a response, he guided Arabella toward a less crowded section of the glasshouse, his hand warm and reassuring at the small of her back. They found a secluded corner sheltered by a grove of bamboo. The Duke turned to face her directly, his expression serious with intent. Arabella, if I may presume, I wish to be entirely clear regarding my intentions. I am not engaging in any form of amusement at your expense. I am not seeking to create scandal for its own sake. I am pursuing your acquaintance because, in the brief time we have known each other, you have engaged my intellect and captured my interest in ways no other woman has accomplished in 37 years of existence. He took her gloved hand gently in his own. I recognize that my attention places you in an uncomfortable position. Society will whisper with increased malice. Your family will worry about potential consequences. And you yourself may question the sincerity of my regard. But I ask only that you grant me the opportunity to demonstrate that regard through continued acquaintance and proper courtship. Arabella gazed up into his face, those strong aristocratic features that had inspired countless matrimonial campaigns, and saw nothing but earnest sincerity in his blue eyes. Your Grace, Alexander, she corrected herself at his encouraging nod. I fear you may be courting disappointment. I am neither young nor conventionally beautiful, and my accomplishments— You are beautiful to me, he interrupted gently, his thumb tracing a soft pattern across the back of her hand. Your intelligence illuminates your eyes, your dignity lends grace to every movement, and your smile, when you choose to bestow it, transforms your entire countenance in the most remarkable way. He stepped closer still, near enough that she could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood that clung to his clothing. I have observed countless debutantes parade their youth and superficial charms before me, Arabella. Not one of them has affected me as profoundly as you did with a single dance and conversation. Arabella felt breathless, caught between decades of ingrained caution and the undeniable pull of the connection forming between them. Society will be merciless in its judgment, she warned softly. Society has always been merciless, he countered with quiet intensity. To you for remaining unmarried beyond their arbitrary deadline. To me for refusing to select a bride according to their preferences and expectations. Perhaps the time has come for us both to cease allowing their cruelty to dictate our potential happiness. The moment stretched between them, fragile yet charged with extraordinary possibility. Then, with a gentle squeeze of her hand, Alexander stepped back to restore proper distance between them. I have overwhelmed you, he observed, reading her expression with uncanny accuracy. Forgive me, I did not intend to press my case so forcefully today. No, Arabella replied, finding her voice at last. That is, I appreciate your honesty. It proves refreshing after so many years of polite fictions and social pretense. He smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his typically austere features and sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. Then perhaps we might continue this conversation over luncheon. I have taken the liberty of arranging a private meal in the director's residence. He is an old friend and has graciously offered the use of his dining room. The remainder of their visit passed in pleasant conversation. As Alexander handed her back into his carriage for the return journey to Peaton House, he asked quietly, "Might I call upon you again tomorrow afternoon?" "Yes," Arabella replied without hesitation, surprising herself with the readiness of her answer. "I should welcome your company very much." His smile, warm and genuine, remained with her long after she had returned home. Chapter 6. The Courtship Deepens. Over the following weeks, London society watched in fascinated disbelief as the Duke of Thornfield's courtship of Miss Arabella Peaton continued with unwavering determination. He called at Peaton House nearly every day, sent thoughtful gifts accompanied by personal notes, and escorted her to exhibitions, concerts, and theatrical performances, appearing utterly indifferent to the whispers and speculative stares their public appearances invariably provoked. For Arabella, who had spent decades relegated to society's margins, the sudden spotlight proved both exhilarating and terrifying. She found herself scrutinized at every turn, her gowns, her deportment, her every word subject to unprecedented analysis and often cruel commentary. "I overheard Lady Fairfax suggesting it must represent some form of wager," Catherine confided, as she assisted Arabella in preparing for an evening at the opera. "That Lord Ashford must have challenged Thornfield to court the most unlikely woman in London." Arabella's hands stilled in the act of fastening her pearl earrings. "And how did you respond to such speculation?" "I informed her that if the Duke had accepted such a wager, he would have chosen someone truly objectionable, perhaps Lady Fairfax herself," Catherine replied with uncharacteristic sharpness. "Honestly, Arabella, the jealousy among the matrons grows more palpable daily. Half the mothers in London have spent years attempting to secure Thornfield's interest for their daughters without success. Now he has chosen you, and their frustration knows no bounds." "Chosen may prove too strong a characterization," Arabella cautioned, though her heart warmed at her sister-in-law's staunch defense. "He enjoys my company. Nothing more has been definitively established." Catherine snorted delicately. "A man of the Duke's stature does not escort a woman to the opera merely because he enjoys her conversation. Arabella, he is courting you with clear intent. The only remaining question concerns the timing of his formal declaration." That evening at the Royal Opera House, seated in the Duke's private box, Arabella remained acutely aware of the opera glasses directed toward them from every quarter of the theatre. The performance featured Verdi's La Traviata, but she suspected that for most attendees, the real drama unfolded in their box, where the Duke of Thornfield sat in intimate proximity to a woman 20 years past her debut season. "You appear distracted," Alexander observed during the interval, his voice pitched low enough for her ears alone. "Forgive me," she apologized quietly. "It proves difficult to concentrate when one serves as the primary object of such intense observation." His gaze swept the theatre, noting the many faces turned in their direction with obvious interest. "Would you prefer to depart early and provide them with even more material for speculation?" "Certainly not," she replied with a small smile. "I shall persevere through the evening's remainder." Alexander's expression darkened slightly. "You should not be required to persevere through an evening at the opera, Arabella, not because of society's petty malice and small-minded curiosity." She placed a gloved hand briefly upon his arm, a gesture of intimacy that would not escape notice by their numerous observers. "I am more resilient than I may appear, Alexander. I have weathered society's indifference for 20 years. I can certainly endure its attention now." His expression softened as he looked down at her hand resting on his sleeve. "Your strength represents yet another quality I find remarkable," he said quietly. "Though I confess myself increasingly angered by the slights and dismissals you have endured over the years. Before she could respond to this passionate declaration, they were interrupted by visitors to their box, Lord and Lady Pembroke, whose daughter had been among the most recent debutantes to fail in securing the Duke's romantic interest. "Your Grace," Lord Pembroke greeted with stiff formality. "Miss Peaton, what an unexpected pleasure to encounter you both at the opera this evening." "Lord Pembroke," Alexander replied coolly, "Miss Peaton possesses great appreciation for musical performances, unlike many who attend merely to display themselves for social advantage." The subtle criticism was not lost on the Pembrokes, whose own attendance at cultural events served primarily social rather than artistic purposes. "Of course," Lady Pembroke murmured, her smile failing to reach her eyes as she addressed Arabella. "How admirable to maintain such interests at that is, most ladies in your circumstances would have withdrawn from society long ago." "I have never perceived virtue in retreat, Lady Pembroke," Arabella replied evenly. "Life offers much of value at every stage, provided one remains receptive to its possibilities." Alexander's eyes warmed with approval at her dignified response. "Indeed," he agreed, placing his hand over hers where it rested on his arm, a gesture both intimate and possessive that caused Lady Pembroke's eyes to widen in shock. A philosophy more individuals should embrace. The Pembrokes, sensing the growing tension, made hasty excuses and withdrew from the box with barely concealed embarrassment. Later that evening, as Alexander escorted her to the door of Peaton House following the performance, he paused on the front steps with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Arabella, I wonder if you might consider accompanying me to Thornfield Manor this weekend," he said carefully. "I host a small gathering each spring for family and close friends. I should very much like you to attend." She stared at him in genuine surprise. A private social call represented one level of courtship. Flowers and books were mere tokens of interest. Even public appearances at cultural venues could be dismissed as the eccentricity of a duke known for unconventional behavior. But an invitation to his ancestral estate to meet his family and intimate circle that constituted a clear declaration of serious intent that could not be misconstrued by anyone. "Alexander, are you entirely certain?" she asked, searching his face in the soft glow of the carriage lamps. "Such an invitation will be interpreted as precisely what it represents, a public statement of your intentions and regard." "I am weary of speculation and whispered commentary, Arabella," he replied with quiet intensity. "I wish to make my feelings unmistakably clear, not only to you but to all of society." Her heart thundered against her ribs. "And what are those feelings, precisely?" In response, he lifted her gloved hand to his lips, his gaze never wavering from hers. "I believe you understand them already," he said softly. "But if you require explicit words, I shall speak them here and now, regardless of who might bear witness." Arabella shook her head quickly, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment and its implications. "No, not here, not in this manner." His expression gentled with understanding. "Then accept my invitation to Thornfield. Allow me to introduce you to those who matter most to me. Permit me to show you the place that has shaped me, for better or worse, throughout my life." The invitation represented a threshold, Arabella recognized, a point beyond which retreat would prove impossible. If she accepted, she would be publicly acknowledging the seriousness of their developing connection, inviting both increased scrutiny and inevitable disappointment, should the relationship fail to culminate in marriage. Yet gazing into Alexander's steady blue eyes, she found herself unable to refuse. Whatever pain might await her in the future, whatever whispers might follow, she would not deny herself this opportunity for happiness she had long since abandoned as impossible. "Yes," she said finally, "I will come to Thornfield Manor." His smile, rare and transformative, illuminated his features completely. "You have made me exceptionally happy, Arabella," he said simply. Chapter 7. Thornfield Manor. The weekend of the Thornfield house party arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though spring itself had conspired to make the occasion perfect. Arabella travelled to Kent in Alexander's private carriage, accompanied by Catherine for propriety's sake, though William would join them on the following day. As their conveyance crested a hill, Thornfield Manor came into magnificent view, a sprawling Palladian mansion set amid rolling parkland, its honey-colored stone facade glowing golden in the afternoon sunlight. "Good heavens," Catherine breathed, leaning forward for a better prospect. "It exceeds even the most elaborate descriptions." Arabella could only nod in agreement, momentarily overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. Here she was, approaching the ancestral seat of one of England's most ancient dukedoms as a potential duchess rather than merely a visitor. The very concept seemed beyond credibility. As their carriage drew to a halt before the imposing entrance, Alexander himself emerged to greet them, descending the wide stone steps with eager anticipation that contradicted his usual reserved demeanor. "Arabella," he said warmly, assisting her from the carriage with gentle hands. "Welcome to Thornfield." For a moment they stood gazing at each other, oblivious to the assembled servants or Catherine being handed down behind them. Then, recollecting himself, Alexander turned to greet Catherine with proper courtesy before escorting them both into the magnificent entrance hall. The interior of Thornfield Manor proved every bit as impressive as its exterior promised: soaring ceilings, marble floors, and walls adorned with ancestral portraits and priceless artworks. Yet despite its grandeur, Arabella sensed a warmth to the house that she had not anticipated, an atmosphere suggesting it served as a genuine home rather than merely a showcase of aristocratic wealth. "I have arranged rooms for you in the East Wing," Alexander informed them as footmen appeared to collect their luggage. "The views of the Rose Garden are particularly fine at this season. I thought you might appreciate them, Arabella." The personal consideration touched her deeply. "Thank you, Alexander. That proves most thoughtful." His expression softened at her use of his given name, still a relative novelty that seemed to please him each time she employed it. "I shall leave you to rest and refresh yourselves before dinner. The other guests will be arriving throughout the afternoon." The gathering that evening proved smaller and less intimidating than Arabella had feared. Perhaps a dozen people, including Lord Christopher Ashford, whom she recognized as Alexander's oldest friend from their Cambridge days. Alexander's younger sister, Lady Eleanor Montclair, a striking woman in her early 30s, his cousin, Lord Henry Montclair, with his wife, and several other couples who appeared to be long-standing family friends. To her surprise and considerable relief, the reception she received proved uniformly cordial, with Alexander's sister going out of her way to make her feel welcomed and valued. "My brother has spoken of little beyond you for weeks," Lady Eleanor confided, as they took seats together before dinner was announced. "I was beginning to think you must possess supernatural powers of enchantment." Arabella laughed softly. "I assure you I am entirely ordinary. Your brother's regard, while flattering, may perhaps be somewhat exaggerated." Lady Eleanor studied her with shrewd eyes, the same shade of blue as Alexander's. "I think not," she said finally with conviction. "Alexander does not exaggerate, nor does he act upon impulse or fleeting emotion. If he has singled you out, Miss Peaton, it is because he recognizes qualities in you that are genuinely exceptional." The dinner that followed proved unlike any social experience Arabella had ever known. Seated at Alexander's right hand, the position of honor typically reserved for the highest-ranking lady present, she found herself at the center of genuine, engaging conversation rather than polite dismissal. Alexander's friends and family engaged her on topics ranging from literature to politics, listening to her opinions with actual attention rather than mere courtesy. Most remarkable of all was the way Alexander himself deferred to her views, drawing her into discussions and valuing her contributions in a manner she had never experienced in society at large. "You see," he said softly during a moment when the others were engaged in their own conversations, "this is why I wished you to come to Thornfield, so that you might see yourself as I see you. Not as London society has labeled you, but as the extraordinary woman you truly are." The simple sincerity of his words brought warmth to Arabella's cheeks. "You are very kind, Alexander." "Not kind," he corrected gently, "observant, and increasingly certain that I have made the right choice in pursuing your acquaintance." Chapter 8. The Proposal. The following morning dawned clear and mild, perfect for the promised tour of the estate. After breakfast, Alexander appeared at Arabella's side, offering his arm with barely concealed eagerness. "Shall we explore?" he suggested, his enthusiasm evident beneath his customary composure. They set out across the immaculate lawns, Alexander pointing out features of the landscape with obvious pride and deep knowledge. It soon became apparent to Arabella that Thornfield was not merely a symbol of his rank and wealth, but a living entity to which he was profoundly connected. "My father viewed the estate primarily as a source of income," he explained, as they paused beside an ornamental lake where swans glided across the mirror-like surface. "But for me, it has always represented something more significant. These lands, these people who depend upon them, they are both a responsibility and a privilege. To be part of something that stretches back centuries and will continue long after I am gone." "You speak of it with such passion," Arabella observed, watching his face as he gazed across his domain. "It is clear how deeply Thornfield means to you." His expression softened as he turned to look at her. "It is my home, Arabella. The one place where I have always felt truly myself, unconstrained by society's expectations and formalities." He paused, something vulnerable entering his gaze. "I wanted you to see it, to understand this aspect of who I am." The simple honesty of the statement touched her profoundly. "Thank you for sharing it with me. It helps me see you more clearly. Not just the Duke that London knows, but the man behind the title." "That," he replied, his voice fervent with emotion, "is precisely what I hoped you would understand. So few people look beyond the dukedom to see the individual beneath. You have done so from our very first meeting, Arabella. It is one of the countless reasons I find myself drawn to you." They continued their walk, crossing an elegant stone bridge that arched gracefully over a narrow section of the lake. In the distance, Arabella could observe other guests enjoying the fine spring weather. "Alexander," she began carefully, "I must ask you something that has been troubling me considerably. Are you entirely certain about this path you are choosing? Society maintains very specific expectations for a man in your position. A duke typically marries a young woman of impeccable lineage, someone who can provide heirs and manage a great household with ease. I am 39 years old, Alexander. The likelihood of my bearing children is uncertain. Reduced, perhaps, but by no means impossible," he completed for her, his tone matter-of-fact. "And while an heir would certainly be welcomed, it is not my primary consideration in selecting a wife." He guided her to a stone bench positioned to overlook the lake and its surrounding gardens, taking her hands in his as they sat together. "Arabella, I have spent 15 years observing young women of impeccable lineage parade before me, each more calculating than the last. I have endured countless dinner conversations so tedious they made me question whether the continuation of my bloodline was worth a lifetime of intellectual starvation." Despite the gravity of the moment, Arabella found herself smiling at his blunt assessment. Surely they could not all have been so dreadful. "Perhaps not," he conceded, "but not one, not a single one, ever looked at me as you do, as though I am a person worthy of genuine interest, rather than merely a title to be acquired." His thumbs traced gentle patterns across the backs of her hands, sending pleasant shivers up her arms, despite the warmth of the day. "As for managing a great household, Thornfield has operated efficiently for centuries under capable stewards. What I seek in a wife is not an administrator, but a companion, someone whose conversation I treasure, whose opinions I respect, whose presence brings me peace rather than obligation." Arabella's heart quickened at the implications of his words, yet still she hesitated. "Alexander, you must understand how society will react. The tongue will be merciless in its judgment. Let them judge as harshly as they choose," he replied with quiet intensity. "I have never governed my life according to society's expectations, Arabella. I see no reason to begin now, particularly when doing so would cost me the opportunity for genuine happiness." He released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that caused her breath to catch in her throat. "I had intended to wait until this evening, after the other guests had retired," he said, his voice betraying rare nervousness. "But perhaps here, in this place that has witnessed the passage of centuries, seems more appropriate." Opening the box, he revealed a magnificent sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds, its antique setting speaking of history and permanence. "This belonged to my grandmother, "The sixth Duchess," he explained, his eyes never leaving Arabella's face. "A woman of remarkable intelligence and strength, who defied convention in her own era. I believe she would approve of my choice." With deliberate care, he slid from the bench to kneel before her on one knee, still holding her gaze steadily. "Arabella Peaton, you have brought light into my life where before there was only duty and obligation. You have shown me that genuine connection is possible, even for someone as guarded as I have become. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Arabella stared at him, scarcely able to believe the moment was real. Here was Alexander Montclair, Duke of Thornfield, the most eligible bachelor in England, kneeling before her, offering not just his name and position, but his heart. "Alexander," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "are you absolutely certain? The world will not understand this choice." "I am not asking the world to marry me," he replied with perfect simplicity. "I am asking you." In that moment, gazing into his steady blue eyes, Arabella felt the last of her doubts dissolve completely. Whatever challenges might lie ahead, whatever whispers might follow them, the opportunity to share her life with this extraordinary man was worth any price society might demand. "Yes," she said softly, then with growing certainty, "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." His expression transformed with joy so pure and unguarded that it stole her breath entirely. Rising, he took the ring from its velvet nest and slipped it onto her finger, a perfect fit, as though it had been created specifically for her hand. "My Duchess," he murmured, raising her fingers to his lips in reverent salute. Then, after glancing around to ensure they remained unobserved, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle, tender kiss to her lips, their first, a seal upon the promise they had just exchanged. When they finally parted, Arabella felt as though the world had shifted fundamentally on its axis, that everything before this moment had been merely preparation for the life now opening before her. At 39 years old, when society had long since written her story as one of permanent spinsterhood, she had found love with a man who valued her true worth above all conventional considerations. "Shall we share the news with the others?" Alexander asked, his eyes still bright with happiness. "Yes," she agreed, her heart overflowing with joy, "though I suspect your sister may have anticipated this development." He laughed, a free, delighted sound she had rarely heard from him. "Eleanor has been hinting rather pointedly that I should secure my happiness before you might reconsider your opinion of me." "Reconsider?" Arabella echoed incredulously, as though such a thing were possible. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house where their news would be met first with celebration from those closest to them, and later with shock and scandal by society at large. But in that perfect moment, with Alexander's strong fingers intertwined with hers and the sapphire gleaming on her hand, Arabella found she cared nothing for what the world might think. She had spent 39 years living according to society's expectations and limitations. Now she would forge a new path as the Duchess of Thornfield, not despite her age and experience, but because of the wisdom and character they had helped shape. Chapter 9. Society's Reaction. The news of their engagement spread through London society like wildfire, igniting a conflagration of gossip, speculation, and barely concealed disbelief. Drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs buzzed with discussion of this unprecedented match. The most eligible duke in England, choosing as his bride a woman of 39, neither beautiful nor wealthy, who had long been relegated to the margins of marriageability. "It must represent some form of peculiar infatuation," Lady Fairfax declared to her circle of confidants over afternoon tea. "Men of a certain age sometimes develop these odd fixations. It will pass naturally, but unfortunately not before he has bound himself to her irrevocably." "Perhaps she has somehow bewitched him," suggested another matron, whose own daughter had failed to secure the Duke's interest during the previous season. "They say her mother's family had connections to those mystical travelling folk from the continent." Such whispers reached Arabella's ears inevitably. Servants gossiped, and Catherine made it her business to report the most outrageous speculations with a mixture of indignation and dark humour. Yet to her own surprise, Arabella found the malicious commentary affected her far less than it might have done previously. "Let them talk," she said to Catherine, unconsciously echoing Alexander's earlier words. In time they will discover some fresh scandal to occupy their attention. The engagement period was brief by society's standards, just 6 weeks, during which Arabella found herself suddenly at the center of unprecedented activity. There were trousseau fittings, meetings with solicitors regarding settlements, consultations about the refurbishment of the Duchess's apartments at Thornfield, and countless other details demanding attention. Through it all, Alexander remained a constant presence, attentive, supportive, and increasingly open in displaying his affection, particularly during their precious stolen moments alone together. Arabella discovered within herself a capacity for happiness she had thought permanently extinguished, a youthful joy that defied her 39 years and the weight of decades spent on society's periphery. "You appear younger with each passing day," William remarked one evening as they sat together in the library at Peaton House. "I would never have believed such transformation possible, but impending marriage clearly agrees with you, sister." Arabella smiled, touching the sapphire ring that now adorned her finger. "Happiness agrees with me, William. Something I had nearly forgotten was achievable." Her brother's expression grew tender. "You deserve it more than anyone, Arabella. No one has earned such joy through greater patience and dignity." Chapter 10. The Wedding. The wedding itself took place at St. George's, Hanover Square, a concession to Alexander's position rather than Arabella's preference for a quieter ceremony. The church filled to capacity, though Arabella knew many attendees came not to celebrate their union, but to witness what society considered an extraordinary spectacle. Yet as she walked down the aisle on William's arm, her gaze fixed upon Alexander waiting at the altar, she found herself indifferent to the whispers that followed her progress. What mattered was the man before her, tall and commanding in his formal attire, his typically stern features transformed by an expression of such evident adoration that it caused murmurs to ripple through the congregation. Their vows were exchanged with clear, steady voices, promises not merely of fidelity and support, but of partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. When Alexander slipped the heavy gold band onto her finger to join the sapphire engagement ring, his hands were gentle, his touch lingering longer than strictly necessary. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," declared the Archbishop. And with those words, Arabella Peaton became Her Grace, the Duchess of Thornfield, a transformation so complete yet so unexpected that she felt momentarily dizzy with its reality. The reception that followed at Thornfield House, the Duke's London residence, proved a study in contrasts. Genuine warmth from Alexander's inner circle, mingling with barely concealed curiosity and skepticism from the broader society who had felt obligated to attend. Yet Arabella found herself moving through the afternoon with serene confidence, Alexander's steady presence at her side, serving as an anchor against any potential criticism or subtle cruelty. "How are you managing, Duchess?" he murmured during a brief moment of relative privacy. The new title sent pleasant tremors through her consciousness. "Remarkably well," she replied with honest surprise, "though I suspect many of our guests still await some revelation that this has all been an elaborate jest." Alexander's expression darkened with protective anger. "They will wait indefinitely then," he said firmly, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "You are mine now, Arabella, as I am yours. The rest of the world may draw whatever conclusions they choose." Later that evening, as their carriage carried them away from the reception toward the beginning of their wedding journey, a tour of Italy that Alexander had insisted upon arranging, knowing it had been Arabella's lifelong dream to see the art and architecture she had only read about, Arabella found herself overwhelmed by the day's events and their significance. "Are you well?" Alexander asked, noting her contemplative silence as they left London behind. "More than well," she assured him, reaching for his hand in the carriage's intimate darkness. "I was merely reflecting on how extraordinary life can prove to be. 6 months ago I had resigned myself to a future of quiet spinsterhood, observing from the margins as others lived their dreams. And now, he prompted softly. Now I find myself embarking on an entirely new chapter with a man I have come to love more deeply than I ever thought possible." The admission, her first spoken declaration of love, came naturally, without hesitation or embarrassment. Alexander's breath caught audibly in the darkness. Then, with movement swift and decisive, he gathered her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss far more passionate than the chaste one they had shared at the altar. When they finally separated, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. "I have loved you, Arabella, since that first waltz," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion, though I scarcely recognized the feeling initially, having convinced myself such sentiment was beyond my capacity. Arabella raised her hand to cup his cheek, marveling at the freedom to touch him, to express the tenderness that had grown between them. "And now?" "And now," he said, drawing her closer still, "I find myself wanting everything with you, a life, a family, if fortune permits it, a partnership in every sense of the word." "Even if society never quite accepts us?" she asked, voicing the one concern that still occasionally surfaced in her thoughts. Alexander's laugh was low and unconcerned. "Society will adapt, as it always does eventually. In time, our match will become merely another entry in the annals of the Ton's history. But what we build together, Arabella, that will be our true legacy, far more significant than any gossip or temporary scandal." As their carriage rolled through the darkening countryside toward Dover, where a ship awaited to carry them across the channel to the continent and the beginning of their shared adventures, Arabella rested her head against her husband's shoulder, marveling at the journey that had brought her to this moment. At 39 years old, when the world had deemed her past all possibility of romance or new beginnings, she had found not merely love, but a partner who valued her for exactly who she was, not despite her age and experience, but because of the wisdom and strength they had helped forge. And Alexander, who had spent years maintaining careful distance from emotional entanglements, had discovered in her a companion whose presence enriched rather than diminished him, whose love had awakened aspects of himself he had thought forever dormant. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead: potential skepticism from society, the practical considerations of blending their lives, the adjustments required in building a partnership after years of independence. But they would confront these challenges as equals, bound not merely by legal ties, but by deep and genuine connection that had defied all conventional expectations. "I love you, Alexander," Arabella whispered into the comfortable darkness that surrounded them. His arms tightened around her shoulders, his lips brushing her temple in a gesture of infinite tenderness. "And I love you, my dearest Duchess, more than I ever imagined possible." Epilogue. 2 years later. 2 years later, the grand ballroom of Thornfield Manor glittered with candlelight and the scent of hothouse flowers as London's finest society mingled beneath soaring ceilings that had witnessed centuries of celebration. At the center of it all stood the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield, their expressions serene as they greeted guests with gracious warmth that had become their hallmark. "They make a distinguished couple, do they not?" murmured Lady Eleanor to William, who had claimed her hand for the evening's opening dance. "One would hardly credit the scandal their marriage once caused." William smiled, watching his sister as she stood beside her husband. Her auburn hair now liberally streaked with silver, but elegantly arranged and adorned with the Thornfield diamonds. At 41, Arabella radiated a confidence and contentment that made her more beautiful than she had ever been in her youth. "Society possesses remarkably short memory when confronted with success," he observed, guiding Eleanor into the dance pattern. "And by any measure their union has proved extraordinarily successful. Indeed, the tongues that had once whispered so cruelly about the Duke's inexplicable choice had gradually fallen silent as the months passed, and Alexander's devotion to his older bride showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, his regard for Arabella had only deepened with time, evident in the way his eyes sought her across crowded rooms, in the attentiveness with which he listened when she spoke, in the private smiles they shared that hinted at connections far deeper than mere social convenience. Across the ballroom, a young footman approached the Duchess, bending to whisper something in her ear that caused her face to light with joy. She turned immediately to touch her husband's arm, conveying some news that transformed his usually reserved expression with evident delight. With brief apologies to their guests, the Duke and Duchess slipped quietly from the ballroom, leaving their visitors to speculate on the reason for their sudden departure. "The nursery, undoubtedly," Lady Eleanor explained to William as they completed their dance. "My nephew possesses remarkable timing for demanding attention during social obligations." William chuckled. "A trait he seems to have inherited from his father, if Alexander's strategic departures from tedious parliamentary sessions serve as any indication." The miracle of Arabella's pregnancy occurring just months after their wedding had silenced the final critics who had whispered about the unsuitability of the match. The birth of James Alexander Montclair, Marquis of Westfield and heir to the Dukedom of Thornfield, 10 months after their marriage, had transformed scandal into fairy tale in the eyes of society. Upstairs, in the elegant nursery suite overlooking the moonlit gardens, Arabella and Alexander stood side by side beside the cradle of their 8-month-old son, watching as his nurse settled him back to sleep after his evening feeding. "He has your determination," Alexander observed softly, his arm encircling his wife's waist. "Demanding attention precisely when it will cause maximum disruption to our social obligations." "And your stubborn nature," Arabella replied with gentle laughter, "refusing to sleep until his requirements are met exactly as he prefers." Alexander pressed a kiss to her temple, inhaling the familiar lavender scent of her hair. "I can hardly fault him for that. I too prefer your attention above that of any drawing room full of guests." The nurse curtsied and withdrew, leaving them alone with their sleeping child, the son that society had deemed impossible, yet who had arrived nonetheless, healthy and strong and adored beyond measure by both parents. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is my life," Arabella confessed, leaning into her husband's embrace. "That all of this, you, James, Thornfield, is real, rather than some elaborate dream." "Very real indeed," Alexander assured her, turning her gently to face him, "though I confess to similar moments of disbelief. How did I exist for 37 years without you, Arabella? It seems inconceivable now." She reached up to trace his beloved features, those strong lines that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. "We found each other when we were ready, I believe, when we had both lived enough to recognize genuine value when we encountered it." Alexander smiled, the warm, genuine expression he reserved exclusively for her and their son. "The most valuable discovery of my entire existence," he agreed, bending to capture her lips in a tender kiss. Below them, music from the ballroom drifted up through the open windows, a reminder of the social obligations awaiting their return. Yet for a moment longer, they lingered in each other's arms beside their sleeping child, savoring the precious reality of the family they had created together. "We should return to our guests," Arabella murmured eventually, though she made no move to leave the circle of his embrace. "In a moment," Alexander replied, his eyes still drinking in the sight of her, his wife, his duchess, the woman who had transformed his life with her intelligence, dignity, and boundless capacity for love. Let them wait just a little longer. And so they remained, the Duke and his extraordinary Duchess, their remarkable love story having silenced the whispers and exceeded every expectation. Together, they had rewritten the rules of possibility, proving that true connection could flourish at any age, that worth lay not in youth or conventional beauty, but in depth of character and authenticity of spirit. In the cradle beside them, young James stirred briefly, his small hand reaching out in sleep before settling back in peaceful slumber, the newest chapter in a love story that had defied every convention and emerged triumphant. Hand in hand, they finally slipped from the nursery and made their way back toward the glittering ballroom below, where society awaited the return of the Duke and Duchess, whose unlikely romance had become the most celebrated love story of their generation. No longer a scandal but an inspiration, proof that love, when genuine and true, recognized no boundaries of age or expectation, and that it was never, ever too late to begin again. As Arabella descended the grand staircase on her husband's arm, the sapphire ring catching the light from 1,000 candles, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the shadows of the Ashworth ballroom to the heart of Thornfield Manor, from spinster to duchess, from resignation to radiant happiness. She thought of all the years spent believing herself unworthy, overlooked, past her time. How wrong she had been, how wrong society had been. Age had not diminished her, it had refined her, prepared her, made her exactly who she needed to be to recognize and cherish the remarkable man who had seen her true worth when no one else had bothered to look. And Alexander, proud, reserved Alexander, had discovered that the greatest treasure was not the one society most valued, but the one his own heart recognized as irreplaceable. As they re-entered the ballroom to applause from their guests, Arabella squeezed her husband's hand. He returned the gesture, his eyes conveying more than words ever could. They had found each other against all odds, defied every expectation, and built a love that would endure for all their days. A love that proved beyond any doubt that the heart knows no calendar, recognizes no limitations, and blooms most beautifully when given the freedom to choose its own path. The orchestra struck up another waltz, their waltz, the one that had started it all. Alexander turned to his wife with a bow. "My Duchess, may I have this dance?" Arabella smiled, that radiant smile that had first captured his attention, and placed her hand in his. "Always, my love, always." And as they swept across the ballroom floor, moving as one, the whispers that had once been cruel now carried only admiration and wonder at the enduring power of a love that had transformed 2 lives and inspired countless others to believe that it was never too late, never impossible, to find one's happily ever after. Love knows no season, no calendar, no age. It blooms when 2 hearts recognize in each other what the world has failed to see, that true worth lies not in youth or beauty, but in the depth of soul and authenticity of spirit. May Arabella and Alexander's story remind us all that it is never too late to begin again, never too late to find the love we deserve, never too late to write our own happily ever after. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 2,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, echoes of romance.